All right, I'm gonna go and get started so you guys can get out of here. Today won't be very long. We're just gonna cover assignment 2 and kind of give you some ideas of how to go ahead and complete it. So we'll fire up idle. And again, you'll need to create a new file. And let's go ahead and throw in our requirements. So we've got the initial comments that need to go up at the top. You guys put in whatever information you got. So in my case, it would be that. Assignment 2. And then we'll copy in the assignment details, just like that. All right. I will get you guys assignment 1 back here real directly so you guys get some feedback. Make sure there's nothing you need for the next assignment here. So there's that one. Throw some comments in front. Let us get started. Okay, so the demo that I go through here, you can use this one as a placeholder, so to speak. In other words, don't copy it line for line, but use it as a way of figuring out how do you want to do assignment 2. So assignment 2, a great place to get started. If you remember at the end of Monday was going to be building a guess the number game. So we're going to do something similar for this particular assignment. You just build a guess the number game. So the first point, you got your initial comments. We're good there. You need at least 2 different comparison operators, Boolean values, etc. So if we have a guess the number game, how would we start? Anybody have any ideas?
A statement picking a number?
Yeah. So between what you said and he said on there, it's the same thing. We need some kind of random number, right? So to get that, we need to import random. And we can call it our random, or just call it our random equals random.randint. And then what do we want a random number between? You want to include 11? All right, so 1 and 10, I'm assuming here. So that was, thank you, because that's what I was trying to point out here. Remember on random int, it's 1 to 10 and includes 10. On range, it goes up to, but does not include. And those two are very easy to confuse, and they're on a quiz. That's the reason I keep re-mentioning it multiple times. All right. So if we want a random number between 1 and 10, we use 1, 10 for this part. So let's see, get random number between 1 and 10. And it makes sense to go ahead and throw comments on top of your code so you remember what that piece of code does. All right. So now that we have a random number, let's go ahead and just print to the user. Welcome to my guess the number game. All right. Please, let's do a print. Please enter a number between 1 and 10. We do something like this, and then we can get the guess, right? So we're going to say guess equals input, something like that. All right. So now we got to do a couple checks to make sure that we can do whatever they type in. So the first thing we're going to check for is if number, in this case, if guess is what? So 1, we need to make sure they gave us a number between 1 and 10. So we would do something like if guess is greater than, it's got to be greater than, be between 1 and 10. 0, right? So if guess is greater than 0, then we can use a Boolean operator of and to also check at the same time that it is what? Say less than 11, right? So what that check will do is it runs 2 checks at once. We're going to first check that it's greater than 0. Then we're going to check that it's less than 11. That makes sure that whatever they gave us for a number is between 1 and 10. All right. Now there's a couple ways to do that. You could do greater than or equal to 1, or it's less than or equal to 10, right? You can write it either way, doesn't matter. All right. So with this first one that we built in here, if it is that, then we want to do some code. So we can say make sure guess is in the range of 1 to 10, right? Now, will this code that we wrote here so far, will that work? So for now, say we just put a print in here and say your guess is valid. And say we put an else down here that says print your guess is not between 1 and 10. All right. We're just going to put that in there for now to make sure our logic is working like we expect it to. So let's go ahead and run this code. And again, you'll need to save it. Make sure you're saving it in some place. And remember that you follow the file name structure. So it should be something like your name, assignment 2, something like that, right? All right. So we got guess the number game. Please enter a number between 1 and 10. Now, if I put in characters, that's going to fail. And we know that, right? So we're not quite to the point where we can check on that, but we know that it's going to fail. Let's go ahead and run this again. If I give an 11, what do we get there? So it says type error. Greater than is not supported between instances of string and integer. Does anybody know how to decode that, looking at this code to see what we forgot? It's saying that I can't test strings to see if they're greater than integers. Yeah, so guess when we get it as an input, remember it's always going to be a string when it comes in from an input, right? So we need to convert this guess to an integer before we can check to see if it's greater than, less than, etc. So how do we convert a string to an integer? Does anybody remember that function? Yep, we use the int function, right? So that will convert guess over to an integer. And now we can check to see if it's valid. So let's go ahead and run that. And if I put in, say, 11, we should get an answer back. Your guess is not between 1 and 10. If we go and test our other side of it, let's say 5, then we can say the guess is valid. All right. So that's a good way to get started. Build this out in little pieces to make sure your code works as you would expect it to. So now instead of saying your guess is valid, we could say something like, well, what should we check? Once we know that their guess is between 1 and 10, what's the next thing we would check? To guess the number game. Yeah, right. Let's check to see if it's the random number right off the bat. So what would that look like?
Equals.
Yep. So if guess, and what would you say? 2 equal signs. Yep.
Yep.
Perfect. Random number, right? That's what we called this random number. Whatever that was up here is now printed down, or we're going to use down here. Now that is an integer, so we don't need to convert it over to an integer. It's already one, right? Does everybody see what we got there? So the first check that we're going to do, this one checks to make sure that the guess is between 1 and 10. Right away, we want to check if the guess is equal to the random number. All right. And again, I called this random. You can call this whatever you want. The only thing you can't call it is random. You could call it number. You could call it something else. It doesn't matter. Right. So we're going to check that. If that's valid, what should we do? You win, right?
Okay.
Say you win. Thanks for playing for now. Okay. Now, because they won right off the bat, we want to end this program right away, right? Because they won. It's the end of the game. So how do we end the program right away? Anybody remember that from the end of yesterday? You could use a break to get out of a loop. We're not quite in a loop yet. You're down the right path. Exit, right? Yep. So to use exit, we got to import sys. And then from here, we can use sys.exit. And that will end the program right at that point in time. Okay. Now we need a condition. If it is not equal to, I guess it's not equal to the random number they suggested, we want to do another check. What's another check you would give them in a guess the number game? There you go. Too high, too low, right? So let's look at what that would look like in code. We could use an elif, meaning we're going to check another instance. So how would we check to see if it's higher? We would start by taking our end guess, right? And then we want to see if it is greater than what? What's that? The random number, right? So we could say random. And if it is, then we could print to the user, your guess is too high, right? How do we check to see if it's lower? Yep. And guess is less than random, right? Print your guess is too low. Okay. Now, if we look at these and see how they're going to get executed, how would this actually work overall? So one, we're going to check to see if it's equal to the random number, right? This one's going to check if it's greater than. This one's going to check if it's less than. Do we need an else here? Is there any case that an else would be there? Not really, right? We already checked to make sure that it's not equal to and that it's not less than or equal to that random number. So we really don't need an else, as there's no case that there would need to be an else. However, we need to have at least one if statement that contains two elifs and an else. So how could we rewrite this in a way that we would have an else? So we have an if, we have two elifs, but we don't have an else in that same chain in order to meet that requirement of the class. Something like that, right? So what we could do is instead of having this buried in, we could also do the check inside of there that it's not. So instead of doing this check right away that it's in the range, we could essentially move this down. And we would move this back to the left. So the first thing we would check is see if it's equal to the random number. Check to if guess is greater than. And this one, we'll check to see if guess is less than. And then we could have something like this. Well, we really don't need this, right? We could turn that to an else. Like, is that what you were saying? So if we convert this to an else, in which case we don't need this line, I'm going to leave it there for now. But we could have just an else that says this same thing down here, basically this line. All right, but will that code work? So we're going to check to see if it's equal to our random number. Then we're going to check to see if it's too high, if it's too low. But we're not necessarily able to find out whether it's through 1 and 10 at this point, right? And if we put something like this here and just add it as another elif, something like this, what's the problem with having that elif there? Exactly. We'll never actually get here because the number is either equal to, or it's greater than, or less than. We'll never have a chance to hit this line of code to find out whether it's greater than 0 or less than 0, because if it's less than, then it's always going to be less than that, right? So the order in which you do your ifs and elifs matter. That was the gist of that little bit there, is you got to make sure that you have these in the right order and that you always want your first one to be the one that pretty much ends everything, right? Like if that hits it, great. From there, we got to do other checks to make sure that we're hitting that. So does anybody have any ideas on what we can do to change that a little bit? So again, if we look at our requirements, we need at least 2 different comparison operators. Well, we have that. We have an equal to, we have a greater than, less than. We're fine. We're covered on those. We need at least one Boolean, and or not. Well, we have an and, which means we're going to be checking 2 of these at the same time. We need at least one if statement that contains 2 elifs and an else. 1, 2, 3. So we really just need an else, but the problem is it doesn't work in this structure. We have to figure out how we're going to change this part to make that better. So let's move this back the way we had it. Oops. We'll leave that part. I'm just going to move this back up here like we had it. We'll take all of this, tab it over, and we'll take our last comment here. All right, so can anybody think of any tweaks to guess the number game that we could do in order to meet having an else statement here? Well, let's expand this. Instead of 1 to 10, let's go to 20. All right. Let's change this to 20. And let's change this to 20. And this to 21. So if we tweak our game a little bit where we add more choices, we can check to see if it's greater than the random number. We say it's too high. If it's less than, it's too high. But let's say that their guess is 5 or more different than what their number is. All right. How could we write that in to check? And where would we put that? Would we put it down here or would we put it up here? Let's just start here. What would that look like if we wanted to see if it was not just too high or too low, but way too high or way too low? And by way, we're defining it with the number 5. So that would be something like int guess, right? We got to have it as an integer. And let's say that is less than the random num plus 5. Everybody see how I did that? And let's throw this in quotes. So the idea, say the number is 5 itself, right? And my guess is 20 or 15. If I take that random number of 5, add 5 to it, and my guess is it less than 15, yes, right? That's going to match. Is that how I want to do that? Anybody got any thoughts? Maybe we write that a different way. Maybe we write it like this. Let's use the greater than now. And int guess. What would that look like? How could we find out if our guess is more than 5 away from the random number? Would we add 5? Subtract 5, right? So let's look at that, just putting that down here. If we take our random number and we subtract 5, and that is still less than our guess, then we know that we're way than 5 off, right? So if we pick something that was only 3 away and we subtract 5, it would be no longer less than, it'd end up being greater than our guess at that point. So we could take this logic and add that to the back here to make sure that we're not way off on that. So we could say it's way too high versus just high. Now, where do we need to put this check? Do we leave it here or do we need to move it in the chain? Yeah, because we want to check to make sure that condition hit before this one, because it would obviously catch on that one, right? Regardless of it's 5 or not, it would just catch on the greater than. It would never hit, is it more than 5? So let's throw it in here. And we can do a check of okay. Everybody kind of see what we got there? Now we could obviously do the opposite of that one. And instead of less than, we could go greater than. Does that still match up with what we think? Or do I have these symbols backwards? So to test that, let's say the random number is 5. If we take 5 minus 5, and our guess is 10, by the way. Notice these symbols don't quite match up, right? I use the inverse symbols. Here I check for greater than, but then I check to see if it's less than. We really want that to be greater than on that side too. So these should be the opposite direction. Less than and less than. Okay, so that added 2 more elifs. Now what can we do to get that else? We could really just take this out, right? Because that is the only other condition left that could possibly hit. It's either too high, too low, or way too high, way too low, too high. The last one is too low, right? We already know the numbers between 1 and 21. We know that that's going to be the only other condition. Therefore, we can get our else. So now we have an if, at least 2 elifs, and an else down at the bottom. We've met the requirements of the homework. So we just tweaked the game a little bit so that we could make these requirements, but it also added some more functionality to the game. Anybody got any questions on that so far? Okay. So let's test our game, make sure it works. I'm going to guess number between 1 and 20. Let's start by saying 25. Good. Our guess is not between 1 and 10, and the game ends. Well, do we really want the game to end? Right? We would want them to keep trying until they give us a valid answer, right? So what could we do that would put them in a loop until they give us the correct answer? In a while loop. Yep, that's a great one. So what we always do is we always want to put our guesses in while loops, right? And the idea is we don't end the while loop until they give us the answer that we want. So if we say while true, and we could do a couple different ways of doing this, but we'll just start with the while true. We'll say, here's our input. Once we get that input, we could say if it's else, at this point, it's going to start this loop back over and they have to type in something, right? Which means if I have this print statement on the outside of the while loop, it would never print that again. And we probably want that printed again. So we're going to move that down inside the while loop. So what does this look like? If we run it, it's up here so we can see it. Guess between 1 and there. I hit 25. Your guess is not between 1 and 10. And it starts that whole loop back over again. Enter a number between 1 and 20. So let's say I do 5. And it says my guess is too low. Well, that means whatever the random number is, we're not more than 5 away from it, or less than 5. And it can't be less than 5 because less than 5 would be 0, right? And we can't be 0 because the number has to be between 1 and 20. Does everybody see how that logic follows? So what do we want to guess at our next guess? 7? Still too low. 8. So we know at this point, it's 9. Uh-oh. Something's not right, right? Now we're way too low. So if we go to 20, we're getting way on the outside. Now we win. Well, that doesn't make sense, right? So we got some flawed logic. Our random number was 20, but it said our number was just too low when we guessed 5. And as we got closer to 20, it said we were way too low. Well, let's go look at our logic. Why were we getting that? So we were seeing what? This cause, and we were seeing this cause up here. So let's plug our number in here just so we could see what that would look like. Let me take this. I'm just going to put this down at the bottom so we can see what that would have been. So our int guess is equal to what? 5, right? When we first started. And our random number is 20. So is 5 less than 20? Okay, so we're good there. And is our random number, which was 20 minus 5, is that less than the int of the guess? In other words, I don't think our logic on the end there is what we thought we wanted it to be, right? As a matter of fact, is we, instead of 5, as I put in 17, that's 3 less than our guess. Well, technically that would be true, right? So do we want to subtract 5 from our random number or 5 from our guess? So do what now? Flip this around? Okay. Which is kind of what we had, and then we flipped it, right? So if we plugged in these numbers and this random guess here would have been 5, is that, right? So now it would say 15. 15 is greater than our guess. That would hit too low, right? Or way too low at that point. But what if our random number was, say, 10? 10 would plug in here. Is 5 less than 10? Yep. Is 10 minus 5 still greater than our guess? It's not. Therefore, we would never hit the way, right? If our random number was 15, 5 is less than 15. That works. 15 minus 5 is 10. 10 is greater than our guess. We would get too far out. So you're right. All we need to do is flip this symbol back the other way. So we come up here. This one should be that way. And this one should be that way. Now, we could change that just by moving these around, moving in guess in first, right? And then do the subtraction. And we could go that direction. Notice how we checked our guess first, then the random number stuff. So it all depends on how you write these, is depending on which symbol you need to use. So let's tear this out. And let's go play our game and make sure the logic works. All right, so we're going to go with 5 again. And now we're way too low. So we know we need to guess at least what? More than 5, but even higher than 10 at this point, right? So let's do 11. Now we're just too low. So we're at least within 5. And we know we got to keep going up, not down. So what would we go with now? 12? Still too low. 14. Still too low. There we go. Did our logic play out when we did 15? Yes. The first time we would have said that we were more than 5 away, but when we said 11, we're no longer more than 5, we're just 5 away, actually 4 away at that point, and therefore we got the appropriate response coming back. So we did this with way too high or way too low. You could say you're getting warmer, you're getting colder. You could change the game however you want, right? You're red hot and you're right next to it kind of thing, which means you're within 3, however you want to do that. Okay, so if we look at this, we have our if statement. We at least have our while statement, but we need at least a break and a continue. All right, so in what condition would we hit here that we could use a break inside this while loop? What's that? If they win, right? We have it go ahead and just end the program right then and there. But we might want to add a break in there. And they could keep going through. What's the other thing you typically have with a guess the number game? If you want to play again, we could do that. Yep. So down here, instead of breaking out, we could say print, do you want to play again? All right, let's take out this thanks for playing part. And then we need to get a check from that user as to whether they want to play again. We could also make sure we ask them the question, yes or no. We could say if, and then we need to get an input from them, right? So we could call that play again equals some kind of input. Okay. And then we just need to check if that equals what we expect it would equal, right? So if play again is equal to yes, then what would we do? We really want it to start over, right? So how do we get this whole program to start over? We're in a while loop. So how do we get the while loop to start over? What's that? Continue, right? That works. Okay, good. You caught that before I even got that far. So the answer there is if we do this and we start over, it will never regenerate a new number, right? So we need to make it regen that number. How would we do that? Well, we could just take this code that generates a new number and put it down here too, right? Now it's going to reassign a new number to that random int and start this whole guess all over again. Okay. This is one way of doing it. There's better ways of doing this game later on once you guys learn more code, but this works great. Okay. If it is not equal to yes, then we need to also check if play again is equal to what? Okay. Oops. All right. So if play again is equal to no, then what do we want to say? Now we can do something like our thanks for playing. And then we could what? Break out of that loop, which will then send them all the way out of this whole thing. And down here at the bottom, we could just do like a sys.exit. We don't really need to because it's kind of implied at that point. And we could even take this print, and instead of having it up here, we could just break out of the loop and say thanks for playing. So the moment we break out of this while loop, which is what happens here, it's going to kick us out, tell them thanks for playing, and in the program. Okay, let's test our logic, make sure we didn't mess something up. So we want between 1 and 20, 25. That's still working like we expect. So anybody know the great way to play guess the number game? You just randomly pick a number. Who's an engineer in here? Anybody? If I wanted to get to the answer in the short amount of guesses, what should I pick?
Divide, conquer the middle.
A little louder. What'd you say?
Divide and conquer. Pick the
There
middle
you go.
number.
And how do you divide and conquer?
10.
10, right? So you always split it. If I got choices between 1 and 20 and I say 10, it's either going to tell me higher or lower, right? And that will get me to the shortest way faster. So anybody in here, computer networking or anything else you do in life, cut the problem in half, figure out where you're at, and see if you need to go one way or the other. And just keep doing that process. So 10 means we're too low. Well, based on the logic of our game, what does that mean? It's now got to be between 11 and 14, right? Because if it was 15, well, technically, yes, it could be 15 because we did 5 when we should maybe want to change that logic to greater than or equal to, right? So that it doesn't catch that. But yes, anywhere between 11 and 15. So what do we do again? We cut it in half, right? So what do we want to go? We want to go the 12 way or the 13 way? Because we can't say 12.5. I mean, we could, but it won't work right. Let's go 13. Still too low, which means our answer is 14 or 15. All right. Now we got our option of playing yes or no. And if I type yes, it starts me back over, right? Notice I had to have capital yes in here for this to be answered correctly. What if I wanted to take all lowercase yes? How could we tweak our code to do that? Or it's equal to, say, lowercase yes, right? And you could chain this out. Maybe we want to go for or play again is equal to yes in this way, right? We could check for all 3 of those cases all on one line. So if the user doesn't follow our directions and type capital yes or capital no, it would answer for every single one of those, right? We could also go ahead and add that on no if we wanted to. So or play again equal no, or play again equal no. You guys will learn some shortcuts for that, but for now, that's how you guys would go ahead and test that. Now, the problem here is what if they type something else other than yes or no? So let's try that. We'll have to guess our number again here. So we go 10. Whoops. Up. I can still break the program by not having a number in there, right? So 10. And we're way too high, which means we're above 5 higher. So now we know this has to be what? Between 5 and 1, right? Somewhere in there. So let's go 3. Guess is too low, which now means it's 4 or 5. Well, that's odd. What did I originally guess? 10. 10 was too high, which means whatever it is plus 5 or minus 5. Something's not quite right yet, right? So let's plug in the math. We should be getting, if we got too high, let's look at too high over here. If we said our guess was 10, 10 minus, well, we don't know what our random number is yet, right? Does anybody know how we could cheat and figure out what our random number is? You just print the random number, right? So we're doing diagnostics. You can always come up here in the print and print the random num so that we could find out what it is. So if we start this over, all right, we know the number 7. We're going to pretend like we don't know that. But if we do 10 and it says it's too high, that logic still checks out. If we did 15, you should be way too high. Actually, this said way too high. Is that right? We shouldn't be way too high, right? We should just be high. So let's go look at that logic for way too high. There. Our guess is 10. 10 is greater than 7. And 10 minus 5 is 5. And is that less than our guess, which was 10? Well, that's why we're getting too high, but this isn't right. Should we subtract 5 here? Now, if we're wanting to go too high, we need to know if it's plus, right? Not minus. This side should be minus on the too low side. All right, so now we got 18. Well, now we can't be too high, so we're going to rerun the program. Okay, now we got 3. So if I say 10, I should get way too high, which tells me I should be between 5 and 1. And so if I picked, obviously my next guess 3, it would do it again. If I type in gibberish, it starts it all over again. But that's not the behavior we want, right? We want them to type either yes or no. So in your program, a lot of times students will come in here and say, well, I don't need this no. I can just say else, because if it's not yes, well, then it's got to be no. And I can restart the whole thing. But the problem is anytime you ask them a question and give them options, you need to just check for those options. So how could we just check for those options and keep them in that loop until they answer it? We could use an else here. And we could say print that is not a valid answer. Please say yes or no. Okay. Problem is, as soon as it hits this else, it quits this chain and starts over, right? So anytime we do an input, we need to put that inside of a what? While loop, right? So we would start a new while loop inside this other one that we're in. And this while true is going to say what? Do you want to type in yes or no? If they say yes, we create a new number and we say continue. But what's the problem with that one? Yeah, it just keeps asking them if they're going to want yes or no. All right. For right now, instead of making this super complicated, we're just going to assume that they're going to type in the correct thing. All right. We can fix that later on because we would call something else as opposed to having a loop inside of a loop. But for now, we'll just go through like this. All right, so now we have our while loop and it must contain a break and continue. We are in a major while loop and we have our break and continue, all right? We need to write something that has a for loop using the range, and we also need to import the random module and use a random number. Okay, well, we obviously did that. So what could we do for a for loop in order to make that advantageous for this game? Right now, they have how many guesses? Many as they want till they get it right, right? So if somebody doesn't understand the logic, maybe we want to hold them to how many guesses? 3, right? In theory, you should get the answer potentially within 3, maybe 4 guesses at most. 5, I could get every answer every time, right? Does everybody see how I could get the answer in 5 questions? Unless I just typed the wrong thing. Because the first one, I split it in half. And then I can find out from there if I'm within 5 or without a 5. Therefore, 4 more guesses, I should be able to get the answer no matter what, unless I'm just not following logic. So say we want to give them 4 guesses in this. How could we change our code where they would get 4 guesses? Yep, we can do something like that. So guesses equals 0 to start, or is it 1? 1 probably, right? The first guess, they come down. If they get it wrong, so for any one of these down here, we would want to add 1 to the guesses, right? At some point, we got to check if guesses is equal to 5, then they've used all their guesses, or in this case, 6, right? So that would have changed this from a while true to maybe we could say if guesses is less than 6. And at that point, they would go ahead and get kicked out, and we would say, thanks for playing. That's one way of doing it. The other way, in order to get our for loop requirement, what's the difference between a while loop and a for loop? Exactly. Yep. So what she answered back there was you have a while loop, which is an infinite number of loops, and you have a for loop, which is always a finite number of loops, right? And in the way we learned it, we used a for loop with a range. So we would say, let's do a range between 1 and 5. And at that point, it will only go through that loop 5 times. Okay. That's one way of doing it. So we could say something like for I in range of 1 to 5. And so I is just the number we're going through there, but we know we're only going to go through this loop how many times? 5 times, right? At that point. So we could take this and actually, instead of putting it outside of our while loop, we could do it inside. Take this whole thing and tab it over. Whoops, there we go. And so now for I in range of this, by the way, we can take out our random number. We don't want to cheat in the game here. So in this main loop, we're going to check whether or not we're in this for loop and go through. The problem with doing this inside of this for loop here is your break and continues aren't going to function like you would expect them to, because now it's going to break out of this for loop, not out of your while true loop. All right. So there's a way to do it in here, but the best way would be not to use it for that particular purpose. We could use this to build some kind of little banner across our thanks for or welcome to our game, right? So we could have something like for I in range of say 1 to 3. Let's print that many hashtags. I don't know. And then when we're done with that, let's go ahead and print that many afterwards. Let's see what that looks like. Okay. Well, we probably don't need 2 of those. We could do 3 of them, but we probably want them a little bit longer, right? Something like that. Doesn't matter how you use the for loop in your code. You just need to use a for loop. So there we go. We got to guess the number game. Looks like if we stretch that out another 5, we would probably have enough. There we go. And we got 1 extra on there to go in between. So if we took 1 out, should give us a nice little header at the top saying guess my number game, and then guess is not defined. That just means that we need to put this back to true like we had it. And there we go. So now we got to guess the number game. Still printing 8 at the top. It should not be printing the random number. Okay, it's back. There we go. Save it, run it. And now our game functions as we intended. So 10. Guess is too high. Knows that we need to be at 5. 5 is too high. 3. 3 is too high. It's 2. Right? So we don't have it to where we're locking them down to the number of guesses. You could do that by tweaking your while true like we talked about, and then going down through that if you wanted to. All right. That could be the flair that you could put on this particular game. Now, based on what you guys know already, instead of me having to try to calculate how many of these there are, what could I do to calculate how many of those characters I need for this? What's that? The len function, right? So how would we use that len function? We could say something like greeting equals, and our greeting is this particular string, right? And we could say our greeting length plus length equals the len of whatever that greeting is. And then how would I use that to determine how many hashtags I need? So you remember there was 2 things we learned. We learned string replication and string concatenation. What does string concatenation do? It allows us to put 2 strings together. What does string replication do? Multiplies the string by however many times we tell it to, right? Sounds a lot like what we want to do here. So if we had the string hashtag and we want to multiply that by, say, 50, we would say 50 and it would give us 50 hashtags. In this case, we could tell it just do it by the greeting length, right? Because len is going to tell us what that number is, and then we can calculate that out. Now, if we wanted to save a line of code, we could just take this here and put this here so that we didn't have to have this line. And then we would just copy this to this line. And so now if we run that, we get the same functionality, but we didn't have to figure out how many hashtags to put there, right? And if I want a little bit of space before I tell it to actually put in the number or guess the number in between, once it gets done doing this, you can always put empty print statements in like that, and that will give you new lines. Again, there's a better way you guys will learn later, but for now, that puts a little bit of space there so your program doesn't look so condensed. All right, game functionality is 10, too high. We're not way too high, we're just too high. So we're going to be something like 7. 7's too high, so we're 6, 5. Something like that. We do a yes. Yes functionality works. Let's do 10. 10, we're too high. 4, or I'm sorry, too low. 18. 18 makes me too high. 16. 15. I'm still too low. There we go. We say no. And it says, thanks for playing, the game ends. All right. When you build your programs out, test them all the way through. Make sure everything works as it's supposed to. Make your roommate, your brother, your sister, your mom, your dad, make somebody go through that code and see if they can break it. All right. And you're building something fun, so somebody wouldn't mind going through your code. Plus, everybody loves to break somebody else's stuff, right? So trust me, somebody will go through your code and love to break it for you. For now, we know that if they type in any letters, it's going to blow up the program. We will eventually find out a way that we can fix that so that we can make sure they're always giving us a number. But for now, this is all we can do. All right. That's the gist of what you could do in homework 2. Is it the only thing? Absolutely not. You can make it up entirely the way you want to do it. This is just a guess the number game. As long as you meet these requirements up here, you can use your imagination and come up with whatever you want. If you're going to use the guess the number game, tweak some of these parameters so it's a little bit different. Don't turn in the homework assignment I just gave you. Use it as a template, but tweak it a little bit in some way. Maybe instead of 5, your game does 3. And you can do the hot and cold, or hot, way too hot, way too cold, whatever you want. Okay? How's everybody feel about the homework assignments? You guys doing okay? Generally, this is how we'll do it. We'll go through the homework assignment, and then you can just tweak it just a little bit. But don't just tweak it and then turn it in without testing it. Because as you saw, it took multiple times for us to figure out the right way to do certain things. You don't just start by coding the entire thing all at once. Don't do that. Break it down in little chunks and start one section at a time, then add a new feature, and then another feature, and then another feature. If you try to code it all at once, it's going to be a spaghetti mess and you won't know where to go back and fix things that are broke. Notice how when things weren't working right in our program, we didn't get errors in our code, right? There's no errors because it's not like we had a typo. It's just we did greater than instead of less than, or we subtracted 5 instead of adding 5. That's just logic you're going to have to think through when you're playing with it. All right, I'll stop the recording.